and welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here, and I really appreciate you listening today. Now, let's settle in and enjoy today's stories. The wind howled through the thick jungle, like a wounded animal, a constant reminder that we were trespassing in a place that had not welcomed human footsteps for centuries. The expedition had begun as a simple archaeological survey, but it quickly became something else, something much darker. My name is Dr. Emily Hawkins, a field archaeologist specializing in ancient civilizations. I've led dozens of expeditions to remote parts of the world, chasing myths and uncovering forgotten histories. But nothing in my career had prepared me for what we were about to discover in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. It all started when we received an unmarked envelope at the university. Inside was a map, old and weathered, with burnt edges, as if it had been rescued from a fire. It showed part of the Amazon basin, with a small red X marked deep in the jungle, far beyond any known settlement or documented ruin. Accompanying the map was a single sheet of paper, with a hastily scribbled note: "Find the lost city of Viracocha. Beware the guardians of the invisible." The lost city of Viracocha. I had heard rumors, of course, tales passed down by indigenous tribes, myths of an ancient civilization that predated even the Incas, place said to be protected by something ancient and powerful. But no credible evidence had ever emerged. Still, the mystery intrigued me. We were between projects, and the lure of a forgotten city was too much to resist. I assembled a small team, just 5 of us. Myself, my trusted assistant David, a local guide called Alejandro, and 2 university students, Rachel and Mark, eager for adventure. 2 weeks later, we were on a plane to Manaus, the gateway to the Amazon. The journey was brutal. The humidity enveloped us like a wet blanket, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. We traveled by boat for several days, navigating winding rivers, until the water became too shallow to continue. From there, we hacked our way through the jungle on foot, following the map, guided by Alejandro's knowledge of the terrain. Each step felt heavy, as if the very air was resisting our presence. Alejandro seemed nervous. Constantly, he looked around and muttered prayers under his breath. On the 3rd night, he confided in me. "Dr. Hawkins," he said, his voice low, "I do not think we should be here. The tribes speak of this place with fear. They say it is cursed, protected by spirits who do not welcome outsiders." I tried to reassure him, but his words made me uneasy. We pressed on, but the jungle seemed to be closing in around us. The canopy above us blocked out the sun, plunging us into a perpetual twilight. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows, clicks, rustles, and the occasional distant howl. It was as if the jungle itself was alive and watching us. Then, on the 7th day, the first sign was a stone pillar, covered with moss and vines, half buried in the undergrowth. We cleared away the vegetation and saw the carvings. Ancient symbols I had never seen before, intricate and almost hypnotic in their design. They seemed to shift and change in the light, as if they were alive. David, my assistant, examined the pillar closely. "These carvings, they look pre-Columbian, but I don't recognize the style. It's like nothing I've ever seen before." We continued on, finding more pillars and broken statues. They all led to a massive stone archway. The entrance was overgrown, almost hidden by the dense foliage, but there was no mistaking it. This was the gateway to something ancient. As we stepped through the archway, an unnatural chill washed over us. The air was thick with an inexplicable tension, as if the ground itself was vibrating with some unseen force. The jungle fell silent. No birds, no insects, just a deep, oppressive stillness. Mark, one of the students, shivered. "Was it just me, or did it suddenly get colder?" "It's not just you," I replied. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Stay close, we don't know what we're up against." We moved deeper into the ruins. The remains of a once great city are slowly revealing themselves, There were massive stone structures, collapsed but still imposing, covered with vines and moss. The architecture was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, alien, almost otherworldly, with angles and shapes that defied normal geometry. We found an open courtyard. In its center stood a large stone obelisk, covered with more of the strange carvings. It was here that Alejandro stopped abruptly. His face was pale. "We should not continue," he whispered. "This place is wrong." "The Guardians? Guardians?" Rachel asked, her voice full of fear. Alejandro nodded. "The unseen ones. They protect this place. We are not meant to be here, but we had come too far to turn back." I approached the obelisk. I ran my fingers over the carvings. They felt warm, almost alive to my touch. I looked back at the team. "We need to document this. Set up the equipment. We may have just discovered the greatest archaeological find of the century." We spent the next few hours setting up camp and documenting the site. As night fell, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The jungle, normally alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was eerily silent. David and I were examining a large stone tablet when we heard it, a distant low humming, like a vibration in the air. It grew louder, and a strange mist began to seep through the trees, curling around our camp like ghostly tendrils. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered. He looked around nervously. Before anyone could answer, the fog thickened and Alejandro screamed, a guttural, primal sound that sent shivers down my spine. We turned to see him standing at the edge of the camp, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," he shouted. "They are here." And then he was gone into the mist, as if swallowed by the jungle itself. We called for him, but there was no response, just the growing hum and the thick, impenetrable fog. Panic set in. We grabbed our torches and began to search. We called Alejandro's name, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had been wiped out of existence. Rachel was the first to collapse. "We have to leave. Now this place is cursed." But the path we had taken into the ruins had vanished. Swallowed by the mist, we were trapped. We huddled together in the middle of the courtyard. The mist pressed in on all sides. The humming grew louder, and the carvings on the seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. Eerie light. I felt a strange sensation, as if the ground was shifting beneath us. "Do you feel that?" asked David, his voice tense. I nodded, fear clawing at my insides. Something's changing. Suddenly the fog lifted, and we found ourselves standing in a different place. The ruins around us had shifted. Walls that had collapsed were now whole, and structures that had been hidden were now visible. The air was different too, heavier, more oppressive. Mark's voice trembled. "What just happened?" "It's as if we've been moved," I said, trying to make sense of it. Or, like reality itself had shifted. Rachel stared at the obelisk, her face pale, looking. The carvings on the stone were changing, shifting like liquid, forming new patterns and symbols. And then, as if guided by an unseen hand, they began to glow. A low, throaty voice echoed around us. It spoke in a language none of us could understand. The ground trembled, and a figure began to emerge from the shadows. Tall, indistinct, with eyes that glowed like embers. The Guardians. The figures moved slowly, their forms shifting and flickering, like shadows caught in fire. They were tall, with elongated limbs, and faces that seemed blurred and distorted, never quite solid. Their eyes were deep, endless voids that drew in the light around them. David stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it? What are they?" The Guardians, Alejandro had warned us, but now it was too late. One of the shapes raised a hand. The air around us grew colder. I felt pressure in my chest, as if something was squeezing my lungs. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The figure pointed at Mark and he screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the air. His body seemed to convulse, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Then, with one last agonizing scream, he was gone, gone as if he had never been there. Rachel fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. David grabbed my arm, his face pale with fear. "Emily, we have to get out of here now." But there was no escape. The figures were closing in. The air was thick with their presence. I felt my mind slipping away, reality bending around me like a funhouse mirror. In that moment, as the guardians surrounded us, I understood. This place, this city, it wasn't just old. It was out of time, a nexus where different realities met. The guardians were not protecting the ruins. They were protecting the barriers between the worlds. We had crossed a line, disturbed something we couldn't understand, and now we were paying the price. I could feel the pull of the unseen, pulling us into the depths of what lay beyond the physical world. My vision blurred. My thoughts became disjointed. David said something, but his words were lost in the hum that filled my mind. The last thing I saw was the obelisk, glowing brighter, the symbols twisting and turning, telling a story I could never understand. And then, darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls in stark contrast to the suffocating jungle I had left behind, my body aching, and my mind was a fog of confusion and fear. David was there, sitting next to me, his face haggard and hollow. "We're the only ones left," he said softly. "Rachel, Mark, Alejandro, they're gone." "What happened?" I asked, my voice weak. David shook his head. "I don't know. The authorities found us wandering near the edge of the jungle. Nobody believes what we saw. They think we just got lost, that we hallucinated it all. But I knew better. The memories of this place were burned into my mind. The city of Viracocha wasn't just lost. It was hidden, protected by forces beyond our comprehension. And now that I had glimpsed the other side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. Something invisible was waiting. If you're reading this, remember, some places to be forgotten, some secrets unsolved. For once you open the door to the unknown, there is no turning back. The jungle swallowed her whole. Every step forward felt like being pulled deeper, into a maze of green walls. The thick canopy above them blotted out the sun. Shadows danced under the towering trees, and the hum of Amazonian life surrounded the group like an invisible orchestra. Leaves rustling, birds screeched, and somewhere in the distance, a low growl echoed through the foliage. The team of 6 had come in search of a myth, stories of a forgotten civilization, swallowed by the jungle long ago, whispered in academic circles. The locals called it Yupanqui, a city said to hold treasures beyond imagination, guarded by the jungle itself. Some believed it never existed. Others said that those who sought it never returned. But for Dr. Michael Carrington, the discovery of Yupanqui could redefine history, and he was willing to take the risk. Days earlier, when they had first left the river, morale was high. They had machetes to cut through the vines, maps marked with promising trails, and supplies to last them for weeks. But the deeper they ventured into the jungle, everything began to slip away. First, the map stopped making sense. Landmarks that should have been there were missing, and paths once thought clear were blocked by dense, twisted growth. Then came the insects. Their bites became a constant torment, and the buzzing wore down their nerves. Finally, the rain began. Not the gentle showers they had expected, but torrential downpours that, pounding against their makeshift shelters, and soaked them to the bone. The jungle felt alive that night, in a way that made their skin crawl. Strange, unidentifiable sounds echoed through the camp. Soft footsteps in the undergrowth, the distant howling of creatures, unfamiliar to even the most seasoned among them. And then, there was the figure. It began with a whisper. Luis, the local, who had led them so far into the jungle, mentioned it in passing. The fleeting image of a man standing in the shadows, watching them from the tree line. At first no one believed him. Tired and stressed, they said, but soon others began to catch glimpses. A silhouette just beyond the firelight. still and silent. Whenever they tried to approach, the figure would disappear, fading into the dense foliage, as if it had never been there. But the feeling of being watched never left until the 5th day. Supplies were running low and tensions were high. Jared, the expedition photographer, had become withdrawn, muttering about shapes in the that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Isabel, the linguist, became ill, feverish, with strange marks on her skin, like tiny bruises in patterns that neither of them could explain. That night Luis disappeared. His bedroll was empty, his clothes untouched. No sign of a struggle, no trail to follow. It was as if the jungle had simply swallowed him up. Panic swept through the group, but there was nothing they could do. They searched until dawn, but found no trace. The next morning, Dr. Carrington insisted they keep going. They were too close, he said, to turn back now. But then the jungle seemed to change. Paths they had traveled only days before no longer existed. The landscape was shifting in ways that defied logic. Trees twisted unnaturally, roots sprouted from the ground like skeletal hands, and the air grew thick with a musty, oppressive weight. It was as if the jungle itself was pushing them deeper, leading them into the heart of something ancient and invisible. The figure reappeared, this time closer, more distinct. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow her every move, but it never spoke, never approached. It just watched, waiting for something. On the 7th day, Jared snapped. He shouted into the jungle, demanding that the figure reveal itself, throwing equipment and supplies into the undergrowth in a fit of rage. His cries echoed through the trees, only to be met with eerie silence. Then, without warning, it took off into the forest. The group ran after him, but he was too fast. His frenzied cries grew fainter, until they were swallowed by the depths of the jungle. They never saw him again. Now, there were only 4. Carrington, Isabel, Marcus, and Ellie, the team medic. Fear hung over them like a shroud. Each of them waited for the next to disappear. As they pressed on, something in the jungle began to change again. The air grew heavier. The trees twisted more, almost unnatural in their formation. The dense vines and foliage seemed to have a purpose, leading them on, to trap them in a labyrinth of their own making. And always the figure remained silent, watching. On the 10th day, they found the ruins. Yupanqui was real, or at least it had been. The crumbling stone. The structures were barely visible beneath the overgrowth, but the remains of ancient carvings and crumbling temples spoke of a once flourishing civilization. But there was no sense of triumph. The city was a tomb, a place that should have been left undisturbed. Isabel collapsed at the entrance of what appeared to be a temple. Her fever had worsened. Her skin was now a patchwork of dark bruises and strange symbols that none of them could understand. She murmured incoherently, her words a mixture of ancient dialects and warnings. "Something is here," she whispered before she lost consciousness. It was Marcus who found the altar, deep within the temple, a stone slab covered in intricate carvings, depicting a godlike figure surrounded by the dead. Offerings of bone and gold lay scattered about its base. But what caught their attention was the small statue at the center. It was carved from a dark stone. Its eyes were hollow and lifeless, yet somehow it seemed to pulse with some strange energy. They shouldn't have touched it, but Carrington, driven by desperation and obsession, reached out, and the floor trembled. The walls groaned, and the jungle outside fell deadly silent. The figure moved at last. It emerged from the shadows. It stepped into the temple, its form now clear. Not a man, but something older, something that had waited centuries for this moment. Its eyes black and infinite, fixed on Carrington as it held out a hand. "You were never meant to find this place," it whispered in a voice like the rustling of leaves. And one by one, the jungle took them back. The last thing Ellie heard before the darkness took her was the sound of the jungle, the endless hum of life and death intertwined, and the whispered promise that she too would become part of the forgotten. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening.